My name is Haver Pendrick, and on a Wednesday morning at 14 minutes past 9, the watch officer of the House of Cromwell knocked once on the door of my office in the curatorial wing and handed me a sealed memo. He did not sit. He stood with his cap under his arm and waited. "A guardsman on long gallery rotation has noticed something," he said. "We thought you should see this before it goes higher. Read it once, then we talk." I had been deputy curator of the House of Cromwell for 11 years. In that time I had received exactly 2 sealed memos through the household's quiet internal protocol, and both had concerned matters I would rather forget. I slid my thumb under the wax. The paper inside was a single folded sheet, written in the small upright hand of a regimental clerk. The memo cited a precise pattern. Every Tuesday morning between 3 o'clock and 1 minute 30 seconds past, the surveillance cameras covering the long gallery lost their feed. 9 months of incidents, filed by household IT as a recurring hardware glitch. The guardsman, whose name was given at the bottom as Sergeant Adair Wessel of the Night Watch, had been logging the gaps independently in a pocket notebook. He attached a clean list, 16 consecutive Tuesdays, 16 identical windows. He had reported, the memo said, only after 2 full months of observation, and only through the proper chain. I read the list once, then I read it again. Then I set the paper down on my blotter and looked at the painted ceiling of my office for a long moment, because I knew immediately whose name was not in the memo. The watch officer was watching me. "You see it," he said. "I see it." "Read it once more," he said, "and tell me you still see it the same way." I did. The Tuesday window, the long gallery, the exact 90 seconds, the fact that no household record-keeping system in the world misfires on a perfect weekly schedule, and one thing more which the sergeant could not have known and the watch officer perhaps had not. The long gallery rotation of high-resolution scanning equipment, the only equipment in the house capable of lifting a portrait without damage and returning it without damage in under a minute and a half, was overseen personally by my mentor, Master Curator Ansel Cromark, who held the keys to the East Bay cabinet and who had taught me everything I knew about the care of paintings. "I see it," I said again. "I will need a week." "You will have 2 months, the watch officer said, quietly. "The Chancellor of the household wants this handled inside the curatorial wing wherever possible. No press, no spectacle, no premature accusation. The sergeant has asked for no credit and would refuse it if offered. Just the truth and then whatever follows from the truth." He paused at the door. He is a good man, the sergeant. He did not enjoy writing that memo. He told me he sat with it for a week before sending it up. "I thought you should know that." "Thank you," I said. When he was gone, I sat at my desk and did not move for some time. Then I locked the memo in the lower drawer, took my keys, and walked down the long carpeted corridor to the long gallery, because I needed to see the room with the new information in my head. The long gallery of the House of Cromwell is 220 years old. It runs the length of the south wing, 90 paces from end to end, oak-paneled to the height of a tall man and gilded above. Family portraits line the western wall in chronological order, the founding generation at the southern end and the present line at the northern. State paintings hang along the eastern wall in heavy frames. The floor is polished parquet laid in a herringbone pattern, and at night when the daylight is gone and the windows are shuttered, the room is lit by low gas lamps left burning in their original sconces, a tradition the household has maintained since the gallery's first opening. The light is warm and soft and a little uneven. A royal guard stands rotation at the northern end of the gallery through the night, in red wool tunic and tall bearskin, white gloves at his sides, rifle held at the order, and he can see the full length of the room from where he is posted. I walked the gallery slowly that morning, with the daylight pouring through the high windows. I passed the founding portraits and the state pieces and stopped at last in the East Bay, where the painting hung that I knew, before any investigation began, would be at the center of everything. It is called The Lady of the Westerly Hall, and it is attributed to a master painter named Auberon Vance, who worked at the height of the late 18th century. The lady is shown seated in 3/4 profile in a pale blue court gown, one hand resting on a small leather-bound volume, the other lifted in a gesture so subtle that visitors often miss it on a first pass, a slight uplift of the fingers, as if she had been about to speak and chosen instead to wait. The painting has hung in that bay since the gallery's opening. It is one of the household's signature works. And for the past 3 years, my mentor Ansel Cromark had been quietly investigating a long-standing scholarly question about whether the lady was the master's own work, or that of a particularly gifted student. I knew because he had told me. Over coffee in his office more than once, he had described his frustration with the formal authentication process, 5 years, 3 committees, an external panel, and his conviction that high-resolution imaging would settle the matter inside an afternoon. He had said it lightly, the way a man says a thing he has decided not to do. I stood in the East Bay for a long time and looked at the lady. Then I went back to my office, opened my notebook and began. The investigation ran 2 months exactly. The Household Security Review Team was assigned to me as quietly as a thing can be assigned in a place like Cromwell, which is to say 2 officers, both senior, both discreet, both of whom understood without being told that whatever we found would be handled with the lightest possible hand. We worked in a small room off the records vault. We did not write a single thing on the official log. We worked from the sergeant's notebook, transcribed and verified, and from the household's own backup systems, which I had access to as deputy curator and which the sergeant had not. The pattern held 16 Tuesdays, then 18, then 20 as the weeks rolled on and we watched the cameras lose their 90 seconds and come back as if nothing had happened. The IT logs continued to flag it as a recurring hardware fault. We let them. We did not correct the record, we watched. The sergeant's notebook, which the watch officer brought to the records room on the second day, was a small black thing with a faded regimental stamp on the cover. The pages were unlined, the entries in pencil, the handwriting small and even. Each Tuesday occupied 1 line, the date, the exact second of the loss, the exact second of the return, a single word in the right margin, the word clean, when nothing else had occurred on the post, which it was every time. There was no commentary, no theory, no speculation. He had not even underlined the dates. He had simply observed and recorded and observed again, and after 8 weeks of identical entries, he had set the notebook on his sergeant major's desk with a 1-page memo asking, in the politest possible terms, whether the watch officer might wish to look at it. In the 3rd week of the investigation, one of the security officers asked me, without looking up from his papers, whether I had a sense of who might have access to the equipment required. I told him I did. He nodded and made a note and did not press. He was a kind man. He understood I was holding 2 things at once. In the 4th week, I went down into the gallery at 3 o'clock in the morning myself, alone, to see what the sergeant had been seeing. I did not tell anyone I was going. I stood at the southern end by the founding portraits and I watched the northern end where the sergeant was at attention beneath the lamps. He did not turn his head. The gallery was very quiet. The gas lamps hissed faintly in their sconces. Somewhere far off in the south wing a clock ticked. At exactly 3 o'clock the small red lights on the cameras in the corners of the ceiling, which I had not noticed until then, went out one by one. They came back on one by one 88 seconds later. The sergeant did not move. He had told us when we asked him that he had noticed the lights too. That had been the first thing he had noticed. That was what had made him start the notebook. I walked back the length of the gallery in the soft gas light, past the portraits, and as I passed the sergeant he did not so much as glance at me. I went back upstairs and sat in the dark for a long while, thinking about the way a man can love a thing too much, and the way another man can watch over a thing for years without ever asking to be seen. In the 5th week we confirmed it. The Tuesday windows aligned, within the second, with the courier schedule of a private high-resolution imaging laboratory in another city, a laboratory that did contract work for museums and university art history departments, and that maintained, in its public registry, a discrete listing for scholarly authentication services by referral. The painting was being driven out of the East Bay of the Long Gallery at 3 o'clock in the morning, photographed at the laboratory through the small hours, and driven back before dawn. The round trip with the imaging took 6 hours. The gap in the cameras was 90 seconds because that was all the time required to lift the painting from its hooks, walk it out of the gallery through the service corridor, and hand it to the courier waiting at the south door. The return required the same 90 seconds, the following Tuesday at 3. The cameras were never tampered with electronically. The system was instructed to perform a brief diagnostic cycle on a schedule by someone with administrative credentials. The diagnostic took 90 seconds. The system recorded its own self-test as a hardware fault. It had been doing so for 9 months. We sat in the small room off the records vault, and we looked at one another, and no one spoke for a long time. Then I asked for 48 hours, and the senior security officer gave them to me. I went to see Ansel Cromark in his office on a Friday afternoon. He was at his desk, reading. The desk was the same desk he had been reading at for 31 years. He looked up when I came in and he saw my face and he closed his book and set it carefully aside. "Haver," he said. I said, "we need to talk about the lady." He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded slowly once and gestured to the chair across from him. He told me everything. He told it the way an honest man tells a thing he has known for 3 years he would one day have to tell. The authentication question had eaten at him since he had first taken the chair. The formal process was a wall, the imaging was the answer. He had paid for the laboratory work out of his own pocket. He had arranged the courier himself. He had used his administrative credentials to schedule the diagnostic cycles. He had taken the painting only on Tuesdays because Tuesday was the household's quietest night, and only at 3 because 3 was the deepest part of the watch. "I told myself," he said, "that I was protecting the lady, that a 5-year wait for committee approval was a longer absence than 90 seconds at a time repeated. I told myself the painting was safer in my hands for an hour than in the queue for a decade." He looked at me. "I was wrong, Haver. I was wrong from the first night. I knew it the first night." "Why didn't you stop?" He was quiet a long time. "Because the imaging was beautiful," he said at last. "Because I was beginning to be sure. Because I loved the work and I wanted the truth of it, and I thought no one would be hurt by a small breach in service of a large one." He shook his head. "It is the oldest excuse in the world, and I should have known better at 68 than I did at 22. I sat with him a while, then I asked him the only question that mattered. "Will you let me help you draft your retirement letter?" He smiled very faintly and said, "I was hoping you would." We wrote it together that evening at his desk. It took 3 drafts. The first was too long, the second too careful. The third, which we kept, was 4 short paragraphs that named the breach, took full responsibility for it, accepted the consequence, and asked, with the dignity I had always known in him, that the lady be returned to her rotation with a quiet provenance update acknowledging the ongoing authentication study. He signed it. I witnessed it. We sealed it and walked it to the Chancellor of the Household together, and the Chancellor read it once and set it down and said very quietly, "Thank you, Ansel." The retirement was announced as a long-planned transition. The master curator's many years of service were honored at a small reception in the West Library. The press was not informed of anything beyond the surface of the event. The household's record-keeping protocols were quietly tightened. The diagnostic cycle was disabled. A new procedure was put in place for any future scholarly imaging, with proper authorization on premises, witnessed at every stage. The sergeant was never named in any internal report. He had requested it that way through the watch officer, and the Chancellor of the Household had honored the request. The matter was filed as a routine procedural review of the long gallery surveillance schedule, initiated, in the official phrasing, following an observation made by the regimental night watch in the ordinary course of duty. That sentence sat on the file like a small clean stone laid over a deep well, and only 4 men in the household, the Chancellor, the watch officer, the senior security officer, and myself, knew what was actually beneath it. I have thought a great deal in the months since about what kind of man writes nothing in the margin of his notebook but the word clean, about what kind of man notices a 90-second pattern in his second week on a post and waits 6 more before reporting it, not because he doubts himself but because he is determined to be sure, about what kind of man takes the report up his chain rather than across to the curatorial wing he could have walked to in 3 minutes. The post is the post. The cameras either work or they do not, and a man at his post writes down what he sees. I have thought about Ansel too, about a curator who carried a question for 3 years and who could not bear the weight of waiting any longer for the institution to answer it. About the small private compromise that grew week by quiet week into a serious breach of the trust the household had placed in him. The breach was not theft and was not malice and was in its own crooked way an act of love for the work. That did not matter in the end and could not matter because the household's record-keeping is the thing that holds 220 years of paintings on their walls. He knew that the first night. He has told me so. The lady of the Westerly Hall was returned formally to her bay. A small new plaque was placed beneath her frame. It reads, "This work is the subject of an ongoing authentication study undertaken by the household's curatorial team." The authentication study, by the way, is mine now. I inherited the file with the office. The imaging Ansel commissioned, which he turned over to me on the morning he left, is extraordinary. I think he was right about the lady. I think she is the master's. We will be able to say so with the proper committees and the proper time within 4 years. I think Ansel knew. I think that was part of what made it so hard for him to stop. On the Wednesday after Ansel's last day, I walked through the long gallery in the late morning. The cleaners were finishing. The light through the high windows fell across the parquet in long warm bars. At the northern end, the day watch had relieved the night, and the gallery was empty of guards for the brief change. I crossed the room and stood for a moment in the east bay. The lady looked back at me with her small uplifted hand. The cameras in the corners of the ceiling were running clean, as they had every minute of the Tuesday past, and every minute of the Tuesdays that would follow. I had met Sergeant Adair Wessel only once in the records room when he had come at our request to confirm the dates in his notebook. He was a quiet man of perhaps 35, with the upright posture and steady eyes of the regiment. He had not asked what we had found. He had not asked what would happen. He had answered our questions in 3-word sentences and had left when we were done. The senior security officer told me afterwards that the sergeant had returned to his long gallery rotation that same night and had taken his post at the northern end of the gallery without a word to anyone about any of it. He was at his post the night Ansel and I walked the gallery one last time together, the evening before Ansel left. We walked from the southern end to the northern. We did not speak. Ansel paused at each portrait. He laid his fingertips very lightly on 3 of the frames, paintings he had cared for the longest. When we reached the northern end, the sergeant was at attention in his red tunic and bearskin, eyes forward, rifle at the order, as motionless as the portraits behind him. Ansel stopped 2 paces in front of him. He looked at the sergeant for a long moment. The sergeant looked straight ahead. Then Ansel inclined his head just slightly, in the small bow that one professional gives another at the end of a thing well done, and he said very quietly, "Thank you, Sergeant." The sergeant's eyes did not move, but after a moment, almost imperceptibly, he inclined his own head in return. We turned and walked back down the gallery together in the warm light of the gas lamps, and behind us the long gallery of the House of Cromwell stood as it had stood for 220 years, and as it would stand, I hoped, for 220 more. The cameras have not lost a second since.